Hello and Happy New Year to everybody. And here we are again in 2023 with some new episodes of Bingley Talks Politics, joined by Finn.
Hello.
And Mr. Cook.
Hello.
And we're going to kick off today with, it's quite an interesting one that we're looking at. We're going to look at potentially three different scenarios, but we'll call them counterfactual or sort of what-if scenario. And we're going to look, it's a sort of mixture between politics and relatively modern history. And we're going to discuss the implications, the consequences, a sort of what-if scenario if something had happened clearly that didn't. But also something that was either could perceivably have happened or is worth talking. Sometimes this is a little bit pointless. People might argue it's a little bit pointless anyway because it didn't. But I think it can get you into some interesting places and then compare with what actually did and sort of see how things can work out. Because obviously there's a lot of things that are unpredictable. Luck is involved, a huge amount, and so forth. And so we've each come up with one. We're going to look at three for a little bit each and see where we get to. It will be fun, he says. And we're going to do it chronologically. Mr. Cook, this is yours. Tell us about yours, Mr. Cook.
So I picked basically the counterfactual that Britain stayed out of World War One. I think it's interesting, and I think what you've said, counterfactuals, yeah, there isn't much point in them, right, beyond like our own entertainment, but I think it does help you understand the context and the setting a lot better, playing around in your head with this stuff. So if we go back to 1914, no one really expects a war is going to take place any time this year until Franz Ferdinand's assassinated. But it's not necessarily completely certain that if there was war, Britain had intervened, right? Because the alliance between Russia and France is only between Russia and France.
So what you're saying, sorry to interrupt, is that it's plausible that Britain, doesn't get involved in our little story,
or even ends up in the Central Powers. Because I think that Germany at the time, first of all, it's not the Nazi Party running Germany; it's Kaiser Wilhelm and his the OHL that are running things. There's an argument that people like Dominic Sandbrook make, and other people like Jonathan Charmley, which is that actually, if you look at which country in Europe is the most democratic in 1914, and which country has the strongest trade union movement in 1914, it's Germany, funnily enough. It's not France. Yeah. It's certainly not autocratic Russia, with mass repression and shootings of peasants. And also, culturally speaking, the Germans and the English kind of arguably got on a lot better than with the French, for instance. Colonially speaking, Germany is not Britain's major enemy, it's France still. And scientifically, Germany, in terms of industry and science and stuff, Germany's kind of trailing ahead there. And there's the big issue with like British interests, right? This idea that there isn't any British interests in Europe, therefore it's best for Britain to stay out. The counterfactual argument that Dominic Sandbrook makes, in terms of this being positive for Britain and the rest of the world and Europe, is that by the time you get to 1918, potentially you've got one country in Europe, Britain, which hasn't intervened, that hasn't expended its manpower or its resources or its armaments. And Britain's in this position where it can kind of negotiate the peace in a similar manner to which the Americans ended up doing, but with the implication that it would be much fairer. Because if you look at Lloyd George back then and stuff, he was much more sympathetic to Germany.
There's a lot of stuff going on here, isn't there? So, there's another interpretation, isn't there? Christopher Clark, his book's called The Sleepwalkers, that essentially, I mean, it's not what he says, but it's like they almost got into a war by accident. We didn't realise what was going on. When we look back at these things, there's a sense of inevitability that creeps in to studying history, political history, whatever sort of history that, we know stuff has happened, so it was bound to happen. But obviously we can debunk that quite a lot, can't we, most times? And so let's assume that, that they don't, in 1914, decide to go to war with Germany. What would happen then with the conflict, whether it would become known as World War One? Because it has already started to a degree, haven't we? We've got the crisis in the Balkans, as Franz Ferdinand's been shot. I'm assuming, all of that's still happening, isn't it? But yet Britain's not reacting. What goes on there?
Well, in terms of how the conflict would actually play out in the end.
Yeah.
Militarily. I guess, well, there's no blockade, right? There's no blockade on Germany if Britain doesn't intervene, so Germany's still getting vegetables, still getting food in, so you don't have, like, the turnip winter in, late 17? So arguably the Central Powers will probably...
Germany wins, doesn't it?
Yeah, almost certainly.
Surely.
Then the question is, well, is Britain in a better position or a worse position there's no doubt that Germany would have stolen all of our trade, almost certainly, or at least would have cornered a massive area.
Because Germany
of the
was
world
looking to
market.
compete imperially and economically with Britain, which was seen as the the British Empire was still going, but there were cracks appearing. Is that fair, or am I inaccurate there?
No, I think so. So Charmley references Thucydides and this idea of the emerging power. So you see it with Athens and Rome. You see it with currently America and China. Back in the 1900s, you saw it with Germany and Britain, arguably. But I don't know if that's too simplistic, because you look at people like Asquith, who I think he said something like, if we join this war, we're going to open up all the world's evils on us or something. And it's like, well, clearly he understood that it was going to be quite a terrifying experience for the country to go through intervening in this war. But then you also have people like Lloyd George who were trying to keep us out until the very last minute. So I don't know if it's completely believable that everyone in Britain was really paranoid about Germany, because I do think from what I've read, there was a massive pro-German sentiment in the UK at the time, arguably more so than France. I think people back then were still not exactly on great terms with France, a lot of individual Brits, I think.
Well, I mean, royal family?
Yeah, there you go. yeah.
I mean, Kaiser was Victoria's grandson.
You've got the famous the Nicky Willie telegram, don't you? And Nicky
yeah.
And this is the thing, was it the personality of the monarchs that dragged us into it, or was it actually these faceless generals? Hindenburg, Ludendorff, Falkenhayn, all these people, and then the Russian side. Was it these people that were, railway timetables and all that stuff? So I do think the Germans, can't deny that the Germans did have some colonial ambitions in Eastern Europe, right?
So, we stay out. Germany dominates a shorter conflict.
It's almost certainly shorter, isn't it?
It's going to be, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then at the end, Britain.
Well,
how do Britain and Germany get on? How do they relate to each other? Say it's in 1916. There's an end to the European War or whatever it's called. And what happens next?
Well, so I'll go back to Sandbrook and shit. So Sandbrook, because it's how the war ends, right? So Sandbrook's assuming that the war essentially ends in some sort of overwhelming German victory, right? And that it creates this kind of Middle Europe kind of organisation, which brings in Belgium, Belarus, the Baltic states, Ukraine, maybe Romania, places like this, and Italy, of course. Or you've got the Charmley version, which is that basically Germany and France exhaust each other to the point that no one actually wins the war. And that's when Britain steps in and negotiates some sort of equitable peace between the multiple sides. So I guess to answer that question, it depends how the war comes to an end. Is it a quick Central Powers victory? Or do you still have that kind of long, drawn-out, attritional battle that took place?
If Britain don't enter... Here we go, bigger questions. So if Britain don't enter World War One, Adolf Hitler never becomes leader of Germany.
This is the big one, right?
Yeah?
Yeah. Well, arguably...
What are you saying, Mr. Cook?
I think it would be hard for Hitler to come to power, almost certainly, because I do think he drew on... I think Versailles was the biggest thing that Hitler drew on, essentially. I mean, you open it up, it's Pandora's box, right? You've got the reparations payments, you've got the territorial, cutting off all this territory, you've got, German-speaking citizens there, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everything...
could go wrong.
Yeah, there's no long-term trend. Well, some people have looked at this and suggest possibly it was, but not necessarily to assert some form of Nazism, fascism in Germany, other than what happened between 1918 and the early 1930s. And most of that is bound up in something to do with World War One.
Yeah,
whether directly or indirectly. And you don't like the Wall Street crash and the impact on Germany because of the arrangements with the USA.
And Lenin, for instance, there's a good chance that the whole Russian Civil War that went on, does that get beaten by the whites pretty quickly? The white movement, the Tsar movement.
So the royal family can assert themselves for longer in...
Potentially, right. And also, the other thing with Versailles, I always wonder, is the issue with Versailles, or is the issue with Versailles that we weren't willing to actually enforce it in 1936 when it was first challenged with the Rhineland? I think that if France and Britain had stood up, maybe Versailles would be looked at a lot differently if World War II had been avoided and had been upheld.
That's another good counterfactual, isn't it? With if they'd have challenged Hitler earlier. But let's just run with the no World War One, no British World War One. So we're saying potentially no rise of Nazism, fascism across Europe.
I think it'd be so difficult. I don't even think
because the seeds of fascism were to do with the problems from World War One.
Look at Italy as well, right? The lack of territory that Italy got the territory Italy didn't get created all of these resentments because they were like, well, why don't we have the Yugoslavian coastline? You know, all these big claims.
Yeah. Gabriele D'Annunzio, the first fascist. We digress. No World War Two.
No World War Two, potentially, right? I mean, there's
no Cold War either.
No Cold War.
Blimey.
And to say
where are we going?
I mean, David Reynolds puts this so well in the sense that World War Two, we speak about it every year. World War Two, it's viewed as this heroic effort on our part that we stood alone, Dunkirk, right? We took down the Nazis. I think it's slightly fabricated, but you look at World War One, it's such a kind of unpopular stepbrother to World War Two. No one wants to talk about it. No one gives it any kind of like attention because I think A, it was such a brutal conflict, it was so bloody, and I think B, no one really knew what we were fighting for in the end. People came out of it thinking, well, if it was the war to end all wars, why was there another war within like 30 years? And I think that makes the case for World War One much more negative than we'd otherwise expect. But it's so many things flow from it, that, like you just said.
So I suppose the whole world order would have been significantly different. I mean, you can go on and on, can't you? There would be no Cold War, no this, no that, no atomic bomb, and
right?
But then,
beginning of the American century is World War One.
So things today would look
much different,
significantly different. What about within Britain itself? So it's dubious to assert that World War One caused virtually all males and a significant portion of women to get the vote, but it is sort of bound up with the end of World War One. Would that have happened at just a different pace?
Maybe, because I don't think the primary motivation for people like, say, like Lloyd George, Stanley Baldwin, a lot of these people that did push the franchise out, I think it was more electoral for them than anything else. I think they viewed, and the same with Asquith, I think they viewed the woman's vote coming in importance and the size of the potential electorate there, and thought, right, there's a lot of gains for us to be allowing them to vote in the first place.
So you're thinking we would have still moved, it would have just been a sort of timing thing rather than a significantly structural difference. But there are certainly a lot of potential things, and it just shows you therefore, doesn't it, that the decisions now, whether it's about the war in Ukraine or whether to do this, the big calls now can have these huge ramifications. I mean, you have to make calls, don't you, as countries, as leaders, and vast majority, make certain calls for certain reasons, maybe to do the right thing or not, and has a big impact. Right, I'm just conscious of time here. We could go on like that for quite a while. I do feel we've only just
half an hour each,
sort of skirted around the surface here, but let's cover a couple more and we'll see. So we're going to go chronologically. So Finn, we're over to you now. Explain what you'd like to discuss.
So I'm in, I think it's 1963 or 1962, and my scenario is that Hugh Gaitskell, leader of the Labour Party, doesn't die. And so obviously 1950s, post Clement Attlee, who led the revolutionary government from 1945 to 1951, he leaves the office as leader of the Labour Party in 1955, and then Hugh Gaitskell becomes leader. Hugh Gaitskell's kind of on the right of the party, fairly anti-European integration. Obviously there's the big speech that you mentioned to me about, 1,000-year nation, we'd eventually get rid of that with by joining the EU. But Gaitskell was on the right of the party, and throughout the 1950s there was kind of a civil war in the Labour Party between the Gaitskellites and the Bevonites. Bevonites being on the left, Gaitskellites being on the right, and that pretty much continued all the way up until the almost consecutive deaths of both Bevan and Gaitskell. And then in comes the shadowy bureaucrat of vague Harold Wilson, who seemingly, by very way of his vagueness of ideology, he was associated with both Gaitskellites and Bevonites throughout. Nobody really knew what he thought. He comes in, he takes the leadership. In 1964, he becomes Prime Minister. And I suppose the question is, by the time Gaitskell died, it looked pretty certain that he was going to become Prime Minister.
So, let's run on then with some potential scenarios that would or wouldn't have happened. I'm not sure which is the right thing to say there. So, no Harold Wilson as Prime Minister. There's Hugh Gaitskell as Prime Minister. Gaitskell wins the election, right? What's different? What's similar? Does it make a difference? We've decided World War One seems to change the world entirely. Yeah. Is this one? It's more domestic, I suppose, but there will be occasional links. But what happens to Britain? We're in the middle of the 60s. What's happening to Britain different if Gaitskell wins?
So, essentially, at first, not much changes. So I'd have expected that Gaitskell would have won the election. It would have been a nice majority, fairly. I mean, it might have been like 1964. Harold Wilson only got a small majority. But for sake of argument, let's just say it's fairly big. And the 1966 election doesn't happen. Anyway, and he'll have a honeymoon period. And at first, everything will be all right. He'll be able to pass a few things. But I think because Gaitskell was associated with the right of the party, very soon he'd start running into problems. Like devaluation of the pound, that happened in 1968, and that was a building problem. You know, there were building economic problems, and they weren't...
Yeah, they would have been there, irrespective. They were already there, were there, structural
Exactly.
problems, so that he would have had to cope with that. You think... Are you saying Gaitskell would have coped less well than Wilson?
I think the Labour Party would have coped less well. It would have started to tear itself apart.
Gaitskell... What's the relationship between Gaitskell and Roy Jenkins?
I don't really know about
Right,
that.
okay. Well, I'm just assuming... What I like to talk about when we're talking about that particular government is all the domestic reforms they introduced. So if we're looking at modern Britain, you can look at the reforms from 64 to 70. You're talking about two Race Relations Acts. You're talking about legalisation... stopping the decriminalisation of homosexuality. Things to laws about abortion, the contraceptive pill, death penalty. Eventually building in 1970 to the Equal Pay Act, led by Barbara Castle. So that was a real energetic and reforming government. Wilson often doesn't get the credit for that. It's often given to Roy Jenkins as a radical Home Secretary. Roy Jenkins was on the right of the party, so I'm not, without being an expert, I'm suggesting him and Gaitskell, he would have got one of those jobs. Mm-hmm. So my suggestion would be that would have still probably happened. I don't think it was dependent on Wilson.
Probably, yeah. I mean, Wilson was always fairly lax. He wasn't as a leader. He wasn't very invasive. He kind of a bit like, I mean, when we talk about Attlee, whenever he spoke over the phone to anybody, he always made it a principle almost to use as few words as possible because he wasn't wasting his time. And he, as a leader... I
like that idea.
Sounds good, doesn't it?
No, it does, yeah.
And as a Prime Minister, he was kind of on a level with his cabinet. He wasn't kind of elevated, he wasn't dominant. And to an extent, Wilson was similar to that, especially when we look back at this in history. Cabinet was a lot more powerful, had a lot more influence. And Wilson, because cabinet... It was a cabinet of giants. You know, you had people like Jenkins,
big figures,
Foot.
Healy.
He had to let cabinet get on with what it wanted to do in order to keep his job.
And so because of the nature of government and leadership and it being a little bit different, it wouldn't have been perhaps to now where you would argue perhaps the leader has become even more dominant, you know, generalisation. You would have said perhaps there hadn't been such a big shift with Gaitskell and with some of the things that they would have got done. Wilson wins again in 66, though. Are you thinking, would have Gaitskell have won a second election?
Well, potentially.
Was he the kind of figure that would have built on some of his, you know, some of the successes they might have had or whatever, and would that have gone on? How would Labour have been different? How would the leadership of the country have been different? Would it?
Depends how soon the Labour Party begins to tear itself apart. If it tears itself apart within a year, then it's pretty much not going to survive. that long, and it's certain, especially when you look at, Wilson in his second term in office from 66 to 70, it was fairly successful. Yet in 1970, Heath still won, and that was without much division, without much
good point. Yeah,
without much rebelling within the party. So if you're adding in the fact that Gaitskell's presiding over divided party, maybe Heath's win would have been even bigger. Maybe the consequences of that would have been Heath would have been in for 2 terms.
Right, work with me on this one, then, Finn. So, okay, you know where I'm going with this. I don't know.
I think I do.
Mr. Cook's nodding. You're nodding. Is it Thatcher time? Mention Margaret Thatcher.
I thought you were going to do the EEC membership.
Well, I mean, we could do... I'm jumping ahead, aren't I? Would we join the EEC? Which would have been then European Community and...
Not under Gaitskell.
Right, so that would have been delayed.
Yes.
Would Thatcher have become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister? Well, I'm thinking, the reason I've got to that is, so the timeline's changing. You say Heath, yeah, okay. Then Heath comes in earlier, maybe with more success. So maybe the 74 elections where Labour sort of squeak home don't happen. And therefore the 70s becomes different. And so Labour aren't the ones where all the mess starts to come at the end of the decade, even though they do start adopting monetarist policies and people misunderstand the period to an extent. So that all goes a bit topsy-turvy perhaps. And then there's not the big win for Margaret Thatcher at the end of the 70s, which many people will look back and say has defined this country ever since. Is it plausible to say Gaitskell not dying causes Thatcher not to be Prime Minister?
Probably.
Yeah?
I'd put money on that. I think Thatcher, she came to power because obviously Heath was put into opposition and he was still sticking around. Willie Whitelaw was off the scene then, so that basically it gifted her. And she was, you can't deny that Thatcher was an incredibly talented politician. She was the best person for the job, but a lot of it was due to...
But we only knew that later, really, didn't we?
Yeah.
We only knew that when she was being Prime Minister and started to be successful as Prime Minister in many people's eyes. So we only knew that sort of later, perhaps, and that's an interesting one.
I think the 70s would have been a Conservative decade, and what would have happened, this is...
Yeah, but this is what I was... Yeah, go on.
Is that the Conservatives would have had the burden of the 70s on their shoulders. Then in the 80s, maybe it's a Labour government, maybe they come back again, because I think the second spell of Wilson in office, it was he was not ready. The Labour Party was not going to come in on a high, he wasn't going to have a honeymoon, he was already tried and tested, people were already sick of him. It kind of just knocked the Labour Party out for a long time.
But as a counter-argument to that, many people sort of see the UK as part of a wider paradigm shift, might be a bit too far there. A wider movement such as Reagan and the Republicans in the 1980s, and the death of that consensus from World War II, that quite centrist policies with both right wing and left wing not being too far apart. The death of that, and here we go with a different economic policy, the new right, different ways of doing things, and Thatcher is just part of that wider movement. However, not every country, certainly in Europe, actually went that way. So it is plausible that could be tipped on its head, and actually you would have a more social democrat type emphasis in the 80s in the UK, because the Conservatives had been in charge of in the 1970s. It would have tipped the other way. Is that what we're...
Very much potentially. I mean, look at the Labour Party in the early 1980s, and it was kind of focused around this idea. Why Michael Foot took power, why there was kind of this left-wing surge, was because the left wing in the Labour Party got very, very powerful. It became the majority because people began to believe that capitalism was on the brink of collapse. So they thought, well, we don't want to be making any more reforms to this flawed system.
Yeah, so they actually go to a different end.
Exactly.
Right.
So potentially that's what happens, or potentially the right wing of the Labour Party managed to stay in power and are stronger because they haven't had the defeat of 1979 election, and they get into government, and then you kind of have some kind of coordination, because in France at the time it was François Mitterrand, and you had in Spain Felipe Gonzalez. It wasn't necessarily all new right. There were social democrats on the scene at the time.
Absolutely.
Can I make a quick point about Gaitskell?
Please do, Mr.
That we haven't. Well, he was the main guy in 1950 that was pushing for the rearmament for Korea.
Ah, well, I was going to ask this question before I got excited about Margaret Thatcher.
Right, yeah.
It's a terrible failing of mine.
Because he was very, unlike, you saw the divide, it was between like Nye Bevan basically and Gaitskell in 1950. Nye Bevan, you also had prescription charges for glasses and dental care, which Gaitskell brought in as Chancellor in 1950. That then pushed Bevan out of the government. And that was a key rivalry that developed. But he was a massive, America-phile. He was obsessed with the Atlantic Alliance, Gaitskell.
So I know where
Vietnam, right? It's like by the time you get to 1964, Gaitskell, he was going to win that election.
So just outline what does Wilson do with Vietnam?
Well, he stays out, right? I mean, Lyndon B. Johnson says, please send me anything. Send me a garrison of Scottish bagpipers, if that's all you can send. But I need a Brit here. Like, I need some sort of British presence in Vietnam to lend it this credibility. And Wilson said no. Because I think Wilson was less ideological than Gaitskell. I think Wilson was fully aware that
I think that's fair. Wilson is a pragmatist.
Yeah, whereas Gaitskell, would he have been able to get Vietnam through the Labour Party? Probably not, right? I don't see him being able to drag Britain in, even if he wanted to maintain this Anglo-American alliance. But it's still interesting.
There's a question, isn't it? Yeah. Would Britain have gone into Vietnam if Gaitskell had been? He
was definitely more tied to the Commonwealth than the Empire.
No, that's interesting.
He would have tried to basically bring that into the 1970s, whereas I think Wilson was very much aware that it was managing the sort of breakup of the Commonwealth by the time we get to...
However, if we'd have had Britain not going into World War One and Gaitskell not dying, we wouldn't have had Vietnam, so, you know... Right, now, I am aware that I was going to suggest that we do some shorter versions of this podcast, and we seem to be going perhaps to a longer version. I think we just plough on for another 10, 12, 13 minutes and perhaps do the last one of these. And so if you are persisting listening to us, thank you very much. I think hopefully we're raising a few interesting points. So we're going to do another 10 minutes or so. We're going to look at one more, right? And I've gone quite recent with mine. I've decided to do some different periods, really. In 2008, Gordon Brown was Prime Minister. He'd just taken over in 2007 from Tony Blair, who'd done 10 years. Now, Gordon Brown... lots of things you could say about him as a politician. Personally, I think quite complimentary, but he's got lots of critics as well. And he was on the cusp of calling an election in 2008, and essentially, for want of a better phrase, he bottled it. He might have got some advice, or it's quite a big deal, isn't it, to go. There'd been one in 2005, so it would have been relatively quick, but that's before the Fixed Term Parliament Act, so it was less of a big deal to just get that through and say, right, dissolve Parliament, go to the election. And many look back on that now saying they probably would have won. Labour would have won, not necessarily with a big majority, but Labour would have won that election. 2 years later, there is an election because there has to be one. Labour lose, not by a lot, so that strengthens the argument because it hadn't gone better for Labour in the last 2 years, and Brown's leadership had been under the microscope a lot. So that sort of strengthens the argument Labour would have won 2 years earlier. And in 2010, the Tories and the Lib Dems stitched together their coalition, and Labour don't have the numbers for a government, or even it's going to be very difficult for them to join with the Liberals. So then we get Cameron and we get Clegg as Deputy Prime Minister, and then we can run that on to now, really, can't we? We've had some form of Conservative government ever since. So, okay. Brown not calling the 2008 election was quite a big deal. What would be... Come on then, people, what would be different?
Would Brexit have happened?
So Brexit... Just talk us through that briefly then, Finn. How do we get to know Brexit from Brown?
Well...
Because there's probably still people who don't want to be in the European Union, whether Brown wins or not, but how does that work?
Well, potentially Cameron's able to... If he wins the 2013 general election, Cameron comes on a bigger majority and he decides, do you know what, I'm going to overrule my backbenchers because I've got this nice big majority, don't have to rely on the Liberal Democrats, I'm not going to risk a referendum, it's just all too much for fuss. and I'm not going to have it.
Because I think it's a fair point to say, if you're unaware of this, that David Cameron really goes for a referendum, A, because he thinks he'll win it, and B, because it's a party it's his party management thing, isn't it? It's a party management strategy to say, look, I'll win it, and I will therefore stop the Eurosceptic, more right-wing element of my party making a fuss for at least the rest of my leadership and maybe beyond. And it backfires. So for a number of reasons, even if Cameron does win the next election, you think it's going to be... The conditions are different. So the conditions for Brexit don't emerge if Brown wins in 2008. Mr. Cook, can you see any major differences?
I don't think it would be a Labour win though in 2008. I think that because I think when you see in 2010, 2008, Brown has the advantage where he can cast Cameron as Bambi, right? Basically, that he's very, very immature, he's very young and inexperienced, never been a cabinet minister, not even worked in politics, he's come from PR, and it's before 08 hits and stuff like that. Even saying that though, because when they got into the debates together, you started seeing Cameron basically trump Brown a lot of the time. You saw the charisma come out, and Brown's kind of like stolid.
Yeah.
But having said that, as you said, even despite all that and the 08 recession, Labour still gets like 200 and whatever, high 208 whatever seats, right? You can easily see a scenario where 2008 is a Lib Dem Labour coalition that, goes into the 2010s basically, and they support, which I think Nick Clegg, maybe not Nick Clegg personally, but his party would be a lot more comfortable supporting a Labour government, I think, than the Tories. And yeah, then you don't have the level of austerity that we saw necessarily. You don't have the party management issues that Cameron did. Whether Brown would have some party management issues, it's Labour that do, tend to go on cyclical issues like this. But I think it would have changed, a fair bit. I think not having Cameron for most of the 2010s would have been influential. You've got a different guy at the top, don't you?
I've got another extension to this argument. What if Blair honoured the Grenada Pact and he went after the first term? So Blair was Prime Minister 97.
So Brown goes even earlier.
Yeah.
Blair'd be remembered way better. Because
Yes.
you don't have at least a fallout end bit of Iraq.
And then you could also add in that Brown would go earlier,
Yes.
and then would hand on, and then David Miliband.
I was about to say, this is the key
the
question,
great,
isn't it?
the Prime Minister that never was.
So I think a lot of it depends on who Brown then passes on to, right?
Yeah, I mean, he only ended up losing to his brother just by,
I don't know
a vote or something, whatever it was more, wasn't it? But he lost that and then went to do something different. So you would have had a different people in charge. I think it's fair to say David Miliband would have been a pretty effective leader, potential winner of elections. Obviously, this is hugely up in the air, and things would have, there would have been a lot of debate about it. I just think the cast would have been different. I think the political cast of leaders would have been different. Would we have ended up with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister if Brown calls that election, or does the pat sticks? And I'd stick my neck out and say probably not.
Well, I think as well with that Brown, there was always a saying, there was a common story that the one person that could have changed Blair's mind on Iraq was Gordon Brown. And people in the room with the two of them apparently could see Tony Blair's mind changing in the moment, because Brown was so forceful with his arguments, but at the end of the day Brown just couldn't leverage. His concern was economic policy, right? He didn't want to have to concede any ground on that for the sake of stopping some foreign policy fiasco that he knew was going to fail anyway. If it does fail, hey Tony, I'm in number 11, so I'm right next door.
So it's kind of win-win a little bit for Brown to a degree. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. And then the conditions you would still have had, if we just go back to the 28 election, you would have still have had the financial crisis, because it was starting then. So therefore you would still have had the need to do something about the fiscal problems. But you might not have had, say, if they'd have won that election or got the coalition, the blaming of public spending, which even George Osborne now just said it was a political tool. Yeah, I did it. He admits, well, I suppose he lied. Maybe that's a bit strong, but certainly he manipulated that to target flabby Labour public spending caused a crash, which is just factually incorrect. Didn't cause a crash, might have contributed to some. There might have been some overspending, but it's not. But it's something else, isn't it? And therefore, all the things that have been, this debate about how much austerity and the cuts were a political decision. you know, that would have maybe been different, and there would have been a different emphasis there, and you would have ended, and that's another reason that we may not have had the Brexit referendum. Yeah. Or if we'd have had a referendum, it might not have gone the way, because austerity probably did play a part in that, and people's anger about the, you know, sort of constant economic problems that they don't seem to be able to get out of. So that's a sort of more recent one, isn't it? That it's just really interesting. You know, looking at Gaitskell, you know, the John Smith one dying in the early 90s. What was it, 94 did he die?
93.
93? 94. It was after the 92 election, wasn't it?
Won.
Yeah.
Major,
He probably, he would.
Yeah.
But then he wasn't Tony Blair, was he?
Exactly. The
policy
would be different. Like, John Smith wouldn't govern as Tony Blair governed.
And it's just those things, isn't it? I mean, political deaths, as tragic as they are for the people involved, they do have these really big impacts one way or the other. And it's that opportunism then.
Yep.
And everybody thought Brown was the one. Brown was the man.
Exactly.
Brown was the obvious choice to become Labour leader in the 90s.
But who mobilised quicker, right?
But Blair, there was always Blair around. But everyone would, most people would have said it's Brown, and then maybe Blair is number two or whatever. But then Blair seizes the opportunity, and, you know, the rest is history, as I say. Yeah, very good, yeah. And there's other examples. You know, it's not always about death, is it? It's about sort of key decisions, key things, and elections are so close sometimes, and they go the other way.
Well, there's the Wilson-Taft Teddy Roosevelt trio. If Teddy Roosevelt does get the Republican Party nomination and runs against Wilson, wins, then do you have a much more interventionist America?
What about, I tell you what, I completely overlooked, and this would be another good one, an American one. What about if they'd actually counted right in the 2000 election and George Bush wouldn't have got in?
That's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, that was so close.
Yeah. And that would have been massively different.
Yeah.
Like it would have been, isn't it?
You might not, they do tend to work in cycles a little bit, and you've had another Democrat, you might not have had Obama then at that time, and he might be president, I don't know. And
we've got JFK Nixon in the 60s, that's another great one. If Nixon had won instead of JFK, how would the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, how would that have played out with Nixon as president? Because
that, again, really, those close elections, it just shows you, just by getting that small number of votes, which is relatively small, can have a big impact on the direction of policy, country, world. Wow, that was good.
Yeah,
wasn't it? Well, we thought it was good anyway. Maybe you did. If you're still listening, tell us, was it any good? Yeah, we had fun with that, and to be honest, I'd like to do some more of those because I think they're really interesting. But we basically decided that a lot would change and the world would be very different. I think just going back 100 years ago with World War One. The significant differences we'll still be living with it, because of that, you know, worthwhile. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you, Mr. Cook.
Thank you,
Finn. And we'll think of a slightly different topic to discuss next week. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.